So what I want to look at today is, why is this the case? Why is it that the Chinese want to go to America, and what can Putin do about it? And what will Putin do about it, okay? So these are the two questions that we're going to look at. First of all, why is the relationship like this? And second of all, what is Putin's strategy of dealing with this? Okay, all right. So to answer this, we need to go back to World War II. So this is the end of World War II, and America has won the war, okay? So this is the United States, USA. This is Europe. And this is East Asia, okay? Japan, basically. But also Taiwan and Korea, okay? All right. So World War II has ended, and the United States has a problem. It's got all these factories that produce tanks, machine guns, airplanes. And now the war is over. So what are you going to do with these factories? You can't just tell everyone to go home and not work, okay? So they make a deal with the Europeans and these Asians. Basically, the deal is this. The Europeans will agree to buy manufactured goods from the Americans. Television sets, radio, bicycles, cars. But then the Europeans and the Japanese are like, we don't have any money. And the Americans are like, don't worry, we'll lend you the money, okay? Not only will we give you the goods, but we'll lend you the money to buy the goods, okay? And this is, and of course, the money is the US dollar. So the US dollar is basically a contract, right? And because the Americans are lending US dollars to the Europeans and the Japanese and the East Asians, they want the US dollars to be actually worth something, right? So the US dollars is pegged to gold, the gold standard. Meaning, the Americans can at any time force the Japanese and the Europeans to give their gold in exchange for the US dollars. Okay, does that make sense? And so this is a really good deal for the Americans. And this is what we call the Bretton Woods system, okay? Bretton Woods, 1944. Where the Americans were to facilitate global trade in order to maintain their manufacturing power, and they would lend other nations the US dollars to participate in this trade, and the US dollars would be backed by gold. Okay? So from 1950 to 1970, this was a great deal for America. And this led to probably the greatest wealth creation in the world, where if you were just like a average white American male, you had the best life possible. Okay, this led to tremendous prosperity in America. But with prosperity comes corruption and complacency. Okay? So what happened was that the Americans started to work hard, but then the Europeans and the Japanese were like, we need to work harder because we need to rebuild ourselves and we need to pay off this American debt, okay? So Europe started to work really hard, the Japanese worked really harder. And then what happened was that the Europeans and the Japanese started to make products that were actually not only cheaper than the Americans could make, but also better, okay? So then what started to happen was that instead of America lending money to the Europeans and the Japanese to buy things from them, they started to borrow money in order to purchase the European and Japanese manufactured goods, okay? So now this relationship goes backwards, all right? Now, USA went from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. But not only that, but the Americans recognized that, you know what? We can print as much money as we want, so we can spend as much money as we want. And so the Americans started to do stupid things, like start a war in Vietnam that they could not win, like send a man to the moon for no particular reason, and the Americans started to spend way too much money. And by 1970, the entire world recognized that, you know what? America owes us a lot of money, but they probably can't pay it off with gold, okay? And then in 1971, Richard Nixon says, you're absolutely right, okay? we can't pay you off with gold, so we're going to move off the gold standard. Okay, so this creates a problem now because everyone's sitting on this US dollar and it's actually worth nothing. So to solve this problem, what Nixon did was he brought in to the system, okay, the GCC, okay, Saudi Arabia basically, as well as China, to create more demand for the US dollar. Okay, so this created the petrodollar. Because from now on, Saudi Arabia would only sell its oil in US dollars. Okay, and so this kept the system going. The thing to appreciate about this is the Americans did this not because it was strategic, not because it showed long-term thinking, but because the Americans by now had become addicted to the US dollar. Do you understand this idea? This is really important for you guys to understand. At this point in history, the US dollar was the global reserve currency. The global reserve currency is unique in human history. We've never had the idea of a global reserve currency where one currency could be the basis for value of all other currencies. Okay? Never has this happened before. What had happened? Because of an accident of World War II, where the Americans won and can impose their system on everyone else. Okay? And before it was tied to gold, and they went off the gold standard. So this is a complete accident of history. And it's terrible for America for many reasons, okay? The first reason is that it's the guarantor of global trade. What does that mean, to be a guarantor of global trade? Well, first of all, it means you have to print a lot of US dollars, okay? Excess liquidity. Okay? You have to print a lot of US dollars so people can use US dollars. And this causes inflation in your system. And it's hard to manage, okay? Second problem is something called an open capital account. What does an open capital account means? It means like I can change the US dollar anytime I want. So money can come into the country, but it can also flee the country. Okay? And that's really problematic if you're trying to control a nation's currency. All right? And the third thing is financialization. Where, because there's so much demand for US dollars, because US dollars is so complex to manage, your economy shifts from manufacturing to financialization. Financialization just means gambling, okay? So this has been terrible for America, the American economy. The problem is that once you have easy money, it becomes addictive, okay? And so the way to protect the system is by expansion, war. You don't care if expanding your system makes any sense. You don't care if expanding your system is good for your nation. All you want to do is expand it in order to create more demand for US dollar because you're so addicted to it, okay? And you go fight wars in order to protect the US dollar. All right? So this is what leads us to China. So to create China, what America did was destroy its middle class and transfer its manufacturing sector to China. It gave China technology, capital, as well as market access. Okay? And the entire intention was to create more demand for the US dollar. Okay? And this also explains the war in Iran, where Iran is not part of the system, and so America wants to destroy Iran in order to make everyone else more dependent on the system. Okay? All right. Now, why did China agree to participate in the system? Because the US dollar solved for China a huge problem. Okay? Huge problem is this. The US dollar, I need you guys to appreciate this, it monetized power. Okay? So I'm the elite in China, and I control millions of people. But so what? Who cares? what the US dollar did was it enabled me to monetize my power. Meaning now that I could take this power and store its value in the US dollar and then export it to the United States where it would be safe. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay? This is what it did. It monetized power in China. Now the elite could use their power over the people and they get rich in America. Okay? So in other words, there were two major beneficiaries of this system that was created, even though this system doesn't really make any sense. The first, of course, is the American elite, the American financial elite. And second is the Chinese political elite. Okay? And this explains why it's so hard for Putin and for Russia to form an alliance with China. Because the elite, their mentality is to use their power and monetize it through the US dollar. So what matters is the US dollar, not the relationship with Russia, okay? Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Yeah?
So I think like it also aligns with the international education of Chinese, which the rich people and the elites that they send their kids to America but not Russia.
Yeah, that's exactly right, okay? So if you think about it, the entire point of society in China right now is to generate as much US dollars as possible, okay? So sending a child to the United States in order to learn English, in order to get the American degree, in order to acclimatize to American society is part of the strategy. Okay? Do you understand? Because the renminbi by itself has no value. If you convert renminbi into US dollars, that has value. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what explains the relationship between the United States and China and why it's so hard for Russia to break into this relationship. There's actually nothing that Russia can offer the Chinese elite. All right? Okay. In fact, the Chinese elite think Russia is a problem because of its militarism throughout the world. All right? So Putin, if he wants to establish a new world order, what he needs to do is ultimately destroy the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Okay? That is his mission. That is his game. If he really wants to destroy the American empire, he needs to destroy the value of the US dollar. Okay? And so the way he does that is by destroying demand for the US dollar. Okay, does that make sense? All right? So we're going to go over Putin's game, his grand plan to destroy the US dollar. Okay, actually, before I do that, one thing that I need to make clear to you guys is that not all Americans think this is a good thing, that the United States has the world reserve currency. In fact, most Americans, if you explain the system to them, they'll be like, yeah, we don't want to be the world reserve currency because one, it causes corruption, it causes all these corrupt people to come to our country, it causes all these illegal immigrants to come to our country, it causes us to go fight wars in Iran, it causes us to support Israel. So yeah, we don't want to be the world reserve currency. The problem though is that they're addicted to it because it's such easy money, okay? So this is a contradiction. On one hand, the Americans know that the world reserve currency is bad for them, but on the other hand, they're addicted to it, okay? So America is basically like a drug addict. And so what do? Well, the only thing you can do is something called a forced withdrawal, okay? A forced withdrawal. Which means that you just deny America's capacity to print money, okay? And the way you do that is by destroying global demand for the US dollar. Okay, does that make sense? This will cause a lot of pain in America in the short term, basically economic depression, civil war. In the long term, this may be the only solution to save America, okay?